Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. This is the fifth video in the immigration series, and the topic of today's video will be the argument against immigration relating to elections and voting blocks. So this is something that you hear a lot of anti-immigration libertarians bring this up. The argument goes along the lines of certain political factions within the government use immigration as a means to build voting blocks to get themselves elected. This is normally done, this argument is normally pointed out in reference to Democrats, liberal Democrats, people that want to increase the socialist programs of the government. That's typically what people will bring up when they discuss elections and voting blocks with respect to immigration. They'll talk about, say, Hillary Clinton and other Democrats wanting to selectively bring in certain groups of immigrants or just massive numbers of immigrants that will come in and vote Democrat and then increase the size of the government. So the first problem here is that from a libertarian perspective, the difference between Democrats and Republicans is, my assessment is, it's at best marginal and in all likelihood simply insignificant. The difference isn't really worth discussing. Because any area where you can point to the Democrats as being worse, you can point to the Republicans and say, yeah, they've got this area here where they're worse. For example, obviously Democrats are big into socialist programs and that sort of thing, like welfare and other entitlements and so on and so forth, and heavy regulation. But the Republicans traditionally are pro-police state, pro-military, and want to expand those programs and spend money on those programs and engage in tyranny based on through those means. And obviously I'm speaking in broad strokes because, both sides ultimately agree on 90 to 95% of the issues. They quibble over small insignificant things such as, well, are we going to have a tax rate of a top marginal tax rate of 39% or 36%, as opposed to the discussion, should taxes exist at all? So when you really get down to it, there's not much difference between the Democrats and Republicans. And really any mainstream candidate that would be running is, again, from a libertarian perspective, the differences are negligible. Now, of course, political factions within the government would prefer to have power themselves as opposed to other factions. So yes, they would use any apparatus, any power apparatus that the government has to ensure that they have, to ensure that they maintain that power. But again, from a libertarian perspective, their policies don't have much difference to them. So whether a bunch of immigrants come in and vote Democrat or Republican is essentially meaningless. And I go over this, I mentioned this in my other video on why I don't vote, because the voting is really a scam in the sense that who you vote for doesn't matter. And the other thing is, and this is true for immigrants as well, who they might be voting for, the choices are pre-selected by those in power. So there's not much difference between them. And ultimately, behind the scenes, they end up cooperating far, far more than they argue and dispute things with each other. So you get 95% agreement between them, and then they quibble over 5% insignificant issues. And in the grand scheme of things, in the long run, choice is put to the people that vote. It doesn't matter which one you choose. It's inconsequential. And I discussed this in my Why I Don't Vote video. I'll put a link to that in the description section of this video, and make sure that people are aware of that. So you can watch that if you haven't already. Another issue here with relating to voting is that voting is a separate act from walking across a government border. The two acts can't be linked together through necessity. So to say because somebody may vote when they cross the border, therefore we can prevent them from crossing the border, doesn't follow. If you look at election statistics, for example, I believe in this past presidential election, and people are more likely to vote in a presidential election than any other election. Nearly 50% of the people did not vote. And off the top of my head, I don't remember whether that is people that are simply registered as voters or people that would be eligible to register and become a voter. I'm not quite certain which one of those it is, but regardless of which one it might be, the point is that's a large percentage of people that simply don't vote. So just because a given person who from another country is walking into this country, that alone does not signify that they are going to vote, much less vote for whatever some libertarian may think is the quote-unquote worst candidate, which again is splitting hairs. You can't use force to prevent one action unless it's necessarily linked to a criminal action, and in this case that simply does not follow. Another problem with the whole voting blocks and elections argument against immigration is, well, I'm going to backtrack a little bit and reiterate. So the issue that is brought up that people make is that the people from other countries will come into this country and vote for the expansion of the government and its power. So the problem is by advocating the prevention of the free immigration and association of people into this country, the only way to do this is to expand the purview and the power of the government through policing services and the military and a bunch of other ways. For example, I hear this is something I hear a lot, is one of the ways that people would like to prevent people from entering the country is regulation of businesses so that they are unable to hire illegal workers. So here we have another expansion, a dramatic expansion of the power of the government to engage in tyrannical and criminal actions against the domestic citizen population. So it doesn't follow that you can, it's actually contradictory to say, well, we would like to prevent the expansion of the government and its power, but in order to do this, we're going to have to expand the government and its power. And furthermore, again, people who make this argument say that the factions within the government are trying to create voting blocks that will vote for them and then vote for the expansion of government power. So because if you want to implement the prevention of free movement and association of people into this country, you have to expand these programs, you have to give more authority to regulatory bodies, for example, regulation of businesses, financial regulation. That just opens a whole host of problems and methods that the government could engage in tyranny. So, but even taking this a little bit further, and going back to and relating this back to the creation of voting blocks via the manipulation of the people who enter the country, by expanding the government and its power to prevent people from entering the country, that also will create voting blocks which have the incentive to vote for ever more expansion of the government. Anybody connected to police and military, or any sort of business that is in support of those things, or any business touched by regulation, has an incentive to manipulate those regulations, and if they benefit from them, to vote for their expansion. If the expansion of those regulations and the expansion of that government power benefits various internal factions and other organizations and firms and people, then they become voting blocks that are going to vote for the further expansion of the government, and most likely through the further restriction and power over the selective admission or restriction of people entering the country from other countries. So you don't solve these problems by expanding government power and utilizing the apparatus of the government to backhandedly, sort of, in a sense, like indirectly prevent government tyranny, or indirectly sort of reduce the size and power of the government. You can't. What ultimately ends up happening is you're using one expansion of the power and size of the government to supposedly combat the other expansion of the size and power of the government. And ultimately what it ends up doing is you end up with bigger government. You're advocating bigger government. You're just advocating a different method by which the government gets bigger, and different ways and different manners in which it actually engages in its tyranny and oppression. So this doesn't solve the problem. It simply maybe changes the form of the problem a little bit, but ultimately it simply doesn't follow. It doesn't fix the problem. It arguably could make it worse, but at a minimum, it appears to be a wash. So as I stated previously, who you vote for, or who a foreigner may vote for, is pretty much inconsequential to the question of the size and expansion of the government, given the people in power selectively use government's levers of power to manipulate the choice before us. The only legitimate question is whether somebody votes at all. Now, it doesn't, again, it doesn't, so what happens here is it doesn't matter who you vote for. The pivotal question is that you vote at all. And again, I will link to my Why I Don't Vote video in the comments, not the comments, the description of this video. So you could make a case that voting is an act, just voting in and of itself is an act of aggression against people who don't vote. However, the degree of culpability here would be minuscule compared to the degree of culpability of people in the government who are actually engaging and actively supporting the execution of the crimes of the government. A person that lives in the country and is voting is pretty much a captive, and while you can make the case that their vote, because they're voting for politicians who ultimately want to engage in criminal activity against us, that is an act of aggression. The level of aggression is minuscule. It would amount to, most likely at best, like a slap on the wrist sort of punishment, if even that. And that's if you accept that particular argument. So let's say that this is true, and let's say that you want to prevent people from entering the country on that basis that they, and let's again set aside the fact that they may or may not vote, and again we'll set aside the fact that it doesn't matter ultimately who you vote for, given all the previous analysis from earlier in the video. We're going to set all that aside and say that you could make a case that you could prevent someone from entering the country on the basis that they might vote. Now here again, the argument comes down to that you're exercising your right of disassociating from people who intend to aggress against you. But here's the problem, and here's the inconsistency that people who make this argument have. The problem here is that it applies equally well to people within the country as it does outside the country. And this is a common theme that through previous videos that I've made on the topic of immigration, I've pointed out that people who make these arguments don't apply them equally. So if you're going to say that you can legitimately prevent people from entering the country on the basis that they will vote, and vote in a manner that you don't like, and vote for the expansion of the government, and vote for the support of politicians who seek to engage in criminal activity against us, then you must also apply this to people within the country, which again, given that I don't know what the exact percentage is, percentage of people who with which the government did not exist is, but it is probably low single digits at best. So of course, you must logically accept that you have to evict probably on the order of 98 to 99% of the population of the country. That simply follows if you're going to use the disassociation argument to prevent people from entering the country on these grounds, and you must universalize it to everyone who may vote for you. I'm sorry, not vote for you, but vote in a manner that will lead to the government aggressing against you. And you must also, again, choose to evict virtually everybody inside the country. And again, it also applies to movements within the country on the basis of people voting in city elections or state elections. Every level of government, therefore, has by this logic, should be managing and restricting the movement of people within its borders to prevent the expansion of its power. And it seems this is one of those arguments that just overall the voting blocks in elections that it strikes me as really bizarre, in the sense that it's trying to utilize the expansion of the government to prevent its expansion. It's simply another case, like I said earlier, I pointed out earlier. It's very bizarre to think that the correct way to limit the size of the government is to utilize expand its power to manipulate the movement of people within its borders and across its borders to supposedly create voting blocks that are going to reduce its power. I don't understand how that really makes sense. I guess, the best I can come up with is that people may think that, it's the best we can do under that scenario. But again, it doesn't follow from a moral aspect, in that you can't morally advocate the criminal activity of the government in order to prevent the criminal activity of the government. It's just logically contradictory when you think about it, and just downright bizarre. So I don't see how this really gets you to gets somebody to the conclusion that it's it's good or it's better if the government prevents the movement of people into the country. So I think that, again, the correct libertarian position is that the open borders policy, where the government has no say or power over the movement of people, is the correct way to implement greater freedom in this country. So again, it doesn't really, I don't see how these arguments get where people want them to. There's one other argument that it kind of relates to public property, which I mentioned 2 videos ago. There is the argument that because the domestic population has claims against public property, that they have the right to, or maybe it's the second best option to getting perhaps full restitution for what's been stolen from them, is that they should be therefore able to vote for the how this public property should be used, and therefore they should be able to prevent the movement of people into the country on this basis. This is one of those arguments that, again, is not universalized, in the sense that it's simply being mentioned in reference to preventing the movement of people into the country via immigration. It is not universalized to all government programs, because the use of the public resources does not simply extend to, for example, the infrastructure that perhaps an immigrant into the country might use on a day-to-day basis. There is much more public. There are many more public resources. The police, the military, literally everything that the government does has its basis in supposed public property that has been stolen from people. So if you're going to make the argument that, well, it's better for people to be able to execute via the democratic and voting process, that people should not be allowed to enter the country, and if more people vote for this than don't vote for it, then this is a better situation. Well, if you watched the public property video that I talked about earlier, you know that this is not. This doesn't follow for a couple of main reasons. I won't get into them in detail here. I'll simply mention. It doesn't get there because you can't make welfare judgments where you can't compare welfare preferences from different people and say that, well, when there is aggression and violence involved in the system that's being used, you can't make that determination. So you can't say that this is just because more people voted for it. You can't say that it's a better policy than the opposite policy. You can't make that conclusion. And again, the other reasoning being that limiting it to, even if you want to limit it to people with ownership stakes, by nature of the ownership stake being somebody can disperse and use that ownership stake as they see fit. They can expand it to anyone they wish. They can split that ownership stake, temporarily grant a portion of it to somebody who wishes to enter the country, and therefore that immigrant is now part of USA Incorporated and a part owner, and has every right to be in the country and utilize the resources and have a say in how they are used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So here again, this simply doesn't follow that you can get to where you want to go. And also, to backtrack to the point I was making was that it's not if you're going to use this argument, then you have automatically justified everything that the government does on the grounds that because people have voted for the government, then what they have voted for is automatically the best possible option short of eliminating the government. Or that you are saying that whatever the government does, as long as people voted for it, is the second best option, or that automatically gets us closer to a stateless society where the government doesn't exist. That doesn't, you end up justifying everything. And again, I don't think any libertarian would really accept this on the grounds that, well, people voted for it, therefore it's okay. For anything, for example, the IRS. I don't think libertarians would be okay with the IRS or claim that the presence of the IRS is therefore the second best option on the basis that, say, a majority of people voted for politicians who would implement a state that would create and support and use the IRS to steal money from us. I think pretty much any libertarian would resort to or reference natural rights of human beings, and again, that goes back to self-ownership and private property acquired via homesteading and voluntary exchange. Or they would make a utilitarian argument about how only free and voluntary interactions between people, which the government, which again is consensual interactions, which the government does not have, since it is not based on consent or voluntary interactions, are the only, those voluntary interactions are the only ones that lead to an increase in general welfare, on the basis that those interactions between people are done because they value subjectively the end state of the other side of that exchange more than they value their current state. So therefore, both people, and because both people have that perspective, they both benefit from the exchange. So again, pretty much any libertarian I'm aware of would make those arguments and reject the idea that simply voting, the fact that a majority of people voted for something meant that it was the second best option or the best we could possibly do, and so on and so forth. I don't think that they would accept that. And again, I would not accept that. I don't accept that in any case. And I'm, again, here saying consistently that I reject it also in the case of immigration policy, and that the proper immigration policy for a libertarian to hold, whether your argument is voting and elections, is an open borders policy where the government has no power and authority over the movement of people either into the country or within the country. So bottom line, again, open borders is the correct policy choice to make, and anything that gets us closer to an open borders policy and actually is a reduction in the government's power over the free movement of people is again the correct direction. So that pretty much covers I think most of what I would like to say regarding voting in elections. I hope again that this was an informative video, and I will see you guys in the next video. I hope you have a great day, and I'll be sure to again put that link to my voting video in the description of this video. So have a great day, and again, I'll see you in the next video.